Okay, so today we're going deep on something pretty heavy, the Great Depression. A whole decade, 1929 to 1939.
Yeah, a decade that, well, pretty much defined worldwide hardship.
Exactly. And, you've all sent in a ton of really fascinating stuff on this. So what we're aiming for in this deep dive is, well, to get at the really crucial stuff. Like, what were the key factors, the main drivers? And how did this period, how did it shape things long term?
It's pretty mind-blowing to consider how massive the Great Depression actually was. I mean, unemployment was at levels that are almost unimaginable today.
Right, like off the charts.
Poverty was everywhere. It was deep and it affected everyone. Production just tanked. Trade between countries, same thing. It felt like every other day another bank or business was going belly up, and this was happening all over the world.
And it went on for a full 10 years.
Yeah.
That's crazy, right? Because, this was right after the Roaring '20s. That time of, like, crazy optimism. Industries were booming, society was changing so fast. It's like, how do you go from that to the Great Depression?
Yeah, it's a dramatic shift. So to really understand it, we've got to look at what was happening during those Roaring '20s. Like, what were the things bubbling under the surface that made everything so vulnerable to collapse?
Okay, so like setting the stage for the crash.
Exactly. So the '20s were a time of massive industrial growth and social change, no doubt. But, and this is important, beneath all that, there were serious weaknesses developing. There was all this money pouring into speculative investments, especially the stock market.
Got it.
And on top of that, banking practices were pretty much unregulated. So credit was super easy to get. People and businesses were piling up debt. And it wasn't just that some folks had way more than others. It was that so much of what looked like prosperity wasn't actually backed up by real buying power. So the whole thing was built on shaky ground.
So not all boats were being lifted by that rising tide, huh? Some were like taking on water fast.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And you can't ignore the growing gap between the rich and, well, everyone else. A big chunk of the economic gains were going to a very small percentage of people. So when spending started to slow down, which it did by 1929, there just wasn't enough demand from everyday people to keep things going. This drop in spending actually caused factories to cut back production and lay off workers even before the stock market crashed.
Okay, so the warning signs were already flashing. And then came the crash, the one everyone always thinks of. The Wall Street crash of October 1929. Like Black Thursday, Black Monday, all of that.
Right. It wasn't just one event, though. It was more like this wave of panic selling that just kept building. So it starts on Thursday, October 24th, Black Thursday, and right out of the gate, the market plunges, something like 11%.
Wow.
Some people tried to buy up stock to stabilize things, but it didn't work. Then comes Monday, the 28th, Black Monday, another huge drop, around 12%, and it all culminates the next day, Black Tuesday, another 11% drop.
That's insane.
Yeah.
Like, people lost everything,
Yeah.
just like that. But didn't things look up for a little while? Like, maybe it was over.
You're right. There was a short recovery from around mid-November 29 to April 1930. The Dow even clawed back some of its losses.
Huh.
But it was a false dawn. The underlying problems were still there, and what followed was a long, brutal decline that just kept going for years. By July of 32, the market had lost a staggering 85% of its value compared to its peak just 3 years earlier. So the crash wasn't just this single shock. It kicked off a downward spiral that lasted years.
So the crash was just the beginning.
Yeah.
And then the whole world gets dragged in. How did this American downturn trigger problems everywhere else?
Well, back then, the U.S. was the biggest player on the global economic stage. We were deeply connected to other countries. So when our economy crashed, it set off a chain reaction. International trade plummeted. The flow of money between countries basically dried up, and everyone just lost confidence in the global economy. American demand for foreign goods vanished. Investment from the U.S. dried up.
And I'm guessing the impact wasn't the same everywhere.
You got it. Some countries were hit harder than others. Take the U.S. and Germany, for example. Both saw huge drops in industrial production. Pretty much the same. But the UK, they were already struggling before the crash, so they weren't hit quite as hard initially. But by 1933, unemployment in the U.S. was around 25%. In Germany, it was almost 30%. It's also interesting to see how countries that devalued their currencies early, like the UK, Argentina, and Brazil, generally fared better than those that stuck with the gold standard, like France and Belgium.
Yeah, that gold standard keeps popping up. We've got to get into that. But first, can we talk about the wider devastation? Like, what was it actually like for people on the ground?
Oh, it was brutal. People's incomes just evaporated. Deflation was rampant, and that might sound good, falling prices, right?
Yeah.
But it actually made things worse. Businesses put off investments, people delayed buying things, hoping prices would drop even more.
Right. It just makes everything grind to a halt.
Exactly. And then you had tax revenues drying up, profits disappearing, international trade, like we said, it collapsed. Cities built on manufacturing and mining were hit especially hard. Construction projects were abandoned. Farmers were in deep trouble too. Crop prices fell by as much as 60%. And in the U.S., the Dust Bowl just piled on the misery, leading to foreclosures and just incredible hardship for farmers.
Sounds like a nightmare. So in the middle of all this chaos, what did governments do? Specifically the U.S. under President Hoover.
Well, at first, Hoover was really reluctant to get the government directly involved in the economy. He was a big believer in letting things sort themselves out, laissez-faire. But one of his most impactful moves was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930. The idea was to protect American businesses by putting really high tariffs on goods imported from other countries.
But that backfired, right? Big time.
Yeah. Pretty much everyone agrees now that Smoot-Hawley made the Depression way worse. It choked international trade.
How so?
Well, other countries saw these tariffs, and they retaliated with their own tariffs on American goods. So global trade just shriveled up. For example, U.S. exports went from over $5 billion in 29 to less than $2 billion in 33. And the average tariff rate more than doubled. So trying to protect American industries just ended up hurting them even more because they couldn't sell their goods overseas. And it made the global economy even weaker.
So it was like building a wall around America, but then realizing all the exits were also blocked.
Exactly. And it wasn't just Smoot-Hawley. All over the world, governments were putting up these protectionist barriers, import quotas, exchange controls, all kinds of things that just made it harder for goods and money to move between countries.
So everyone was just trying to hunker down and protect themselves, which ultimately made the whole situation worse. And this is where the gold standard comes in, right?
Yeah. The gold standard was a key reason the Depression spread so quickly and hit some countries harder than others. So, under the gold standard, every country's currency was directly tied to gold. It meant that every dollar, every pound, every franc was supposed to be backed by a certain amount of gold held by that country's government.
So it's like a golden handcuff?
Kind of. It really limited what a country could do with its monetary policy. So let's say investors started moving their gold out of a country because they could get better returns somewhere else. That country would then have to reduce its money supply, let prices fall, which leads to deflation.
So it was like being stuck in a gilded cage. You had this valuable thing, gold, but it was stopping you from doing what you needed to do to fix the economy.
That's a great way to put it. And if you look at when countries abandoned the gold standard, it tells a really interesting story. The ones that ditched it earlier tended to recover faster. The UK, for example, bailed on gold in September of 31 because they were hemorrhaging gold reserves. Japan and Scandinavia followed suit later that year, and they generally did better than the countries that hung on to gold for longer. Like France, they were part of the gold bloc, and they didn't give up gold until 35 or 36. Interestingly, China, which was on a silver standard, actually managed to avoid the worst of the Depression. So it seems pretty clear that having more control over your currency and your money supply was really important for getting through this.
Okay, so flexibility was key. And
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier that there were all these bank failures. Let's dig into that a bit more. What were some of the biggest ones? And how did they make things worse?
The banking system was like a house of cards during the Depression. One of the most significant events was the run on the Bank of the United States in late 1930. Now, this was a private bank. It wasn't actually connected to the U.S. government, even though it had United States in its name.
Right, that's confusing.
It is. But when it failed, it caused massive panic. People thought if a bank with that name can fail, any bank can fail. It really accelerated the banking crisis that was already underway. To give you an idea, in just November and December of 1930, over 600 American banks closed, and the Bank of the United States accounted for about a third of all the deposits lost in those 2 months.
Wow.
It was a huge blow to public confidence in the entire banking system.
And I know these banking problems weren't just in America. You mentioned Germany and Britain too, right?
Exactly. In Germany, it was the collapse of Credit Anstalt, a big Austrian bank, in May 1931 that triggered their crisis. The whole thing was made even worse because Germany was already really politically unstable at that time, with extremist groups gaining ground. Investors got spooked and started pulling their money out of the country as fast as they could. The Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, lost a ton of its gold reserves, and in the end, they had to declare a bank holiday. That means they closed all the banks, just shut them down.
That's drastic.
It was a desperate move. And all this economic turmoil in Germany really helped the Nazi Party, which ended up taking power in 1933. It's a stark reminder of how economic crises can fuel dangerous political movements.
It's a scary thought, for sure. And what about Britain? How did their banking crisis play out?
Well, Britain's crisis hit in the summer of 31. Global investors, worried that Britain was going to abandon the gold standard, started yanking their gold out of London. It was a run on the pound, basically. They did get some emergency loans from other countries, but it wasn't enough. This financial pressure caused a huge political crisis. The Labour government was totally split on how to deal with the growing deficits. Eventually, they formed this national government, a coalition of all the major parties. And then, in September of 31, they did it. They ditched the gold standard. And as we talked about earlier, that move probably helped them weather the rest of the Depression better than a lot of other countries that stared on gold.
So it seems these banking crises just poured gasoline on the fire. It wasn't just that people lost their savings and businesses lost access to credit. It was this total loss of faith in the entire economic system. Okay, let's move on to recovery efforts. Most countries started to turn the corner around 1933, but it was a long, slow process. What can you tell us about the different strategies countries used to try to get out of the Depression and the debates about what actually worked?
Right, so 1933 was a turning point for many countries. But the recovery was uneven and painfully slow for some. In the U.S., for example, it took more than 10 years to fully recover the economic output they'd lost, and unemployment stayed high throughout the 1930s. In the U.S., President Roosevelt launched the New Deal in 1933. It was a whole bunch of programs designed to give direct relief to people who were out of work, create jobs through public works projects, and make changes to the system to try to prevent future crises. But even today, economists still debate how much the New Deal actually helped.
Yeah, you hear different opinions on that all the time. Some say it was essential, others say it actually made things worse.
Exactly. There's the monetarist view. Economists like Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz argued that the real problem was the shrinking money supply. All those bank failures really choked off the flow of money, and they blamed the Federal Reserve for not doing enough to fix it. Their argument is that if the Fed had stepped in more aggressively, pumped more money into the economy, and helped banks stay afloat, the Depression would have been much shorter and less severe. Even Ben Bernanke, the guy who was running the Fed during the 2008 financial crisis, he admitted that the Fed's actions, or inaction, played a big role in both how bad the Depression got and how long it took to recover.
Okay, so the monetarists put the blame on the Fed.
Yeah.
And then you have the Keynesians, who are all about government spending.
Right. John Maynard Keynes argued that the private sector just wasn't spending enough to get the economy moving again. So he said the government needed to step in and spend money, run a deficit if necessary, create jobs through public works projects and other initiatives. Roosevelt did do some of that with the New Deal, but some Keynesians argue he didn't spend nearly enough, at least not early on. They say it took the massive government spending of World War II to really get the economy going again.
So the two sides disagree on whether the government did too little or too much. What about Irving Fisher's debt deflation theory? How does that fit in?
Fisher focused on the dangers of having too much debt in the economy. He argued that when people and businesses start panicking about their debts, they try to pay them down as quickly as possible, so they sell assets. But that drives asset prices down. And suddenly, the real burden of their debt becomes even bigger because the value of what they owe is now greater than the value of what they own. It's a vicious cycle. This leads to more bankruptcies, even more selling, more deflation, and eventually a deep and prolonged economic slump. And this was exactly what happened in the Great Depression. People had racked up a ton of debt in the 1920s, often on very risky terms. When the crash hit and asset prices started falling, it triggered this massive wave of debt liquidation that just sucked the life out of the economy.
Sounds like a downward spiral that's hard to escape.
It is.
Yeah.
And all those bank failures just made it worse. Then there's the expectations hypothesis. This one's interesting because it focuses on the psychology of the situation.
Okay, like how people feel about the economy.
Right. The idea is that expectations about the future have a huge impact on what people actually do. So in 1933, when Roosevelt came into office and started shaking things up, it changed people's expectations. They started believing that the economy might actually recover, and maybe prices would start rising again. This shift in expectations, even though interest rates were already super low, encouraged people to start investing and spending again because they thought things were going to get better. On the other hand, the recession of 1937-38 is often blamed on people getting spooked. They thought Roosevelt might backtrack on his policies, and that fear made them pull back again.
So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If people believe things are going to get better, they often do. And if they think things are going to get worse, well.
Yeah, confidence plays a huge role in the economy. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about how the Great Depression affected women and families.
Yeah, it must have been really tough on families.
It was incredibly difficult. For women, especially housewives, managing the household budget became a nightmare. Incomes were slashed or completely gone. Birth rates plummeted because families just couldn't afford to have more kids.
Right.
And while women in some sectors, like white-collar jobs, maybe didn't face as many layoffs as men in heavy industry, there was this growing pressure to limit families to just one income. So a lot of married women ended up leaving their jobs if their husbands were still working. But then, at the same time, you also saw more married women looking for part-time work or taking on informal jobs to try to bring in some extra cash.
So it's this complicated situation where women were being pushed out of the workforce on the one hand, but also forced to find ways to earn money on the other hand.
Exactly. It was a real catch-22. But amidst all the hardship, you also see incredible resilience and resourcefulness. In rural areas, women expanded their gardens to grow more food. They got really creative, using things like feed sacks to make clothes. And in communities, especially among African American women who are known for their quilting, people relied on each other, sharing resources and skills. Oral histories from that time really capture how families coped. They made do with cheaper food, recycled and mended everything, bartered for goods and services, and relied on extended family and neighbors for support.
It's inspiring to see how people band together in tough times. Did governments do anything specific to try to influence how families were coping?
Yeah, there were some interesting approaches. Japan, for instance, was pursuing deflationary policies, and their government actually launched campaigns encouraging people to reduce their spending and save more.
Wow, like a national belt-tightening campaign.
Exactly. But then you have Germany under the Nazis. They had this 4-year plan. And part of that was a really aggressive effort to reshape how households consumed. They used propaganda and other measures to promote thrift, encourage people to buy German-made products, and basically align their spending with national goals.
So two very different approaches. One focused on individual savings, the other on controlling consumption for the benefit of the state. Okay, let's talk about the end of the Depression. Most historians agree that World War II was the decisive factor. How did that work, economically speaking?
Well, the simple answer is that the war created massive government spending, which is exactly what the economy needed. It's like the opposite of what was happening during the Depression. Suddenly, there was this huge demand for all kinds of stuff, especially weapons and other military equipment. This boosted factory production like crazy and created millions of jobs. In Europe, the rearmament that started in the late 1930s already had an effect, reducing unemployment. But when the U.S. joined the war in late 41, things really took off. About 10 million Americans left their civilian jobs and joined the military. And for the first time in over a decade, the unemployment rate dropped below 10%.
So it was the war effort that finally got the economy moving again. Not exactly a happy ending.
No, not at all. But it's the reality. The sheer scale of government spending during the war just dwarfed everything else, and it finally overwhelmed the forces that had been dragging the economy down for so long.
So looking back, we've discussed a lot of different explanations for the Depression and how it finally ended. Can you give us a quick recap of some of the main theories economists had put forward?
Sure. We talked about the Keynesian view, which focuses on the lack of spending in the economy. They believe the government needs to step in and fill that gap with its own spending. Then there's the monetarist view, which blames the Depression on the shrinking money supply, especially due to bank failures, and argues that the Federal Reserve could have done a lot more to prevent it.
Right.
Then you've got other theories, too. The Austrian school thinks the Depression was the inevitable result of an unsustainable boom fueled by easy credit in the 1920s. Marxists see it as proof that capitalism is inherently unstable. And then you have theories that focus on inequality and underconsumption, or the idea that there was just too much production capacity and not enough demand to absorb it.
So it's not a simple story. There were a lot of factors that contributed to the Depression, and even today, there's no single universally accepted explanation. Okay, last question. Where did the term the Great Depression even come from?
Well, the British economist Lionel Robbins is often credited with popularizing the term. He used it in his book in 1934. But Herbert Hoover actually used the word depression quite a bit while he was president to describe the economic situation.
So maybe Hoover should get some credit.
Maybe so. And it's interesting that before the Great Depression, people usually called these kinds of downturns panics. The word depression was already around, but it was usually used for smaller economic slumps, like what we now call the Long Depression of the late 1800s. And of course, the term Great Depression has been used to describe other severe crises too, like the economic collapse in the former Soviet Union in the 1990s.
And then there's the Great Recession of 2008. Hard not to compare them.
Absolutely. There are definitely some parallels in terms of the financial instability and the economic pain. But there were also big differences in the underlying causes and how governments responded. The most important difference was that the U.S. wasn't on the gold standard in 2008. That gave the Federal Reserve a lot more freedom to maneuver. They could print money and do other things to try to stimulate the economy without worrying about gold reserves.
Right.
And the Great Depression was all about deflation prices falling. Whereas in 2008, the big fear was inflation prices rising too fast. And of course, in both cases, rising inequality played a role. It's also worth noting that Ben Bernanke, the guy who was running the Fed in 2008, had actually spent a lot of his career studying the Great Depression. So the lessons of the past were definitely on his mind when he was making decisions during that crisis.
Wow, that's fascinating. So this has been a really amazing deep dive into the Great Depression. We've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about the crazy boom of the Roaring '20s that set the stage for the crash, the global impact, the various theories about what caused it, and the long, hard road to recovery. And one of the biggest takeaways, I think, is just how fragile our economic systems are.
I agree. And how interconnected everything is. What happens in one country can have huge ripple effects around the world.
Definitely. And it's clear that the decisions governments make during a crisis really matter. And ultimately, it's the everyday people who bear the brunt of these economic shocks. So to all of you listening, what do you think are the biggest vulnerabilities in our global economy today? What are the things that keep you up at night? It's a question worth thinking about, for sure. And we encourage you to keep digging into the sources we've talked about today and learn more about this crucial chapter in history.
Absolutely. History may not repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme.
That's a great way to put it. Okay, that's it for today. We'll see you all next time.
See you then.